The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor the moment Elena Voss dropped it, and every head in the grand ballroom turned toward her. "Careful," a sharp voice called out. "Some of us actually paid to be here." Elena's hands trembled as she knelt to gather the broken glass. Her fingers moved fast, but the woman standing above her did not move at all. Priya Whitlock stood in a gown the color of blood, diamonds catching the chandelier light, her lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "I am so sorry," Elena said quietly. "It slipped." "Of course it did." Priya's voice carried across the room, loud enough that conversations nearby began to fade. "Tell me, sweetheart, do they train you people to apologize, or does it just come naturally?" A few nearby guests laughed. Elena felt her face burn. She was 24 years old, wearing a black uniform that did not fit quite right at the shoulders, and she had been standing on her feet for 6 hours straight. She had taken this job through an agency that supplied extra staff for large events, and she had been told, very clearly, to stay invisible. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact with guests. Smile, but do not linger. She had broken all 3 rules in the span of 30 seconds. "I'll clean this up right away," Elena said, reaching for the small dustpan clipped to her belt. "Leave it." Priya's tone sharpened. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor, and looked Elena up and down the way someone might examine a stain on a white tablecloth. "Where did they even find you? You don't belong in a room like this. You're just a stranger here, dressed up to look like you matter for one night." The words landed harder than Elena expected. She had heard worse from difficult customers before, but something about the way Priya said it, so casually, so certain of her own superiority, made the room feel smaller. Elena's throat tightened. She kept her eyes down, focused on a piece of broken glass near the toe of her shoe, and told herself this would be over soon. She needed this job. She needed the money. Her mother's hospital bills did not care about pride. "I understand," Elena said softly. "I'll be more careful." "You'll be more careful," Priya repeated, mocking the accent, mocking the softness in Elena's voice. Her friends, a small cluster of women in equally expensive dresses, tittered behind their glasses of wine. "Honestly, I don't know why the foundation even hires people like you for events like this. It ruins the atmosphere." Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides, hidden in the folds of her uniform. She thought of 100 things she wanted to say. She said none of them. Instead, she straightened her back, lifted her chin just enough to keep her dignity, and began to turn away toward the kitchen doors at the far end of the ballroom. "I wasn't finished," Priya said, and grabbed Elena's wrist. The grip was not gentle. Elena gasped, more from surprise than pain, and the small dustpan clattered from her hand onto the floor a second time. The sound rang out across the ballroom like a bell, and this time, the entire room seemed to notice. Conversations stopped. The string quartet in the corner faltered for half a beat before recovering. Every eye in the grand hall turned toward the scene unfolding near the center of the floor. "You're just a stranger," Priya said again, louder now, clearly enjoying the audience she had gathered. "A nobody wearing a uniform. Do you understand that? You don't belong here, and you never will." Elena's cheeks burned with humiliation. 200 of the city's wealthiest people were watching a woman twice her confidence tear her apart in public, and not one of them said a word to stop it. She felt tears building behind her eyes and hated herself for it. She would not cry, not here, not in front of these people. And then, from somewhere behind the crowd, a voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "Let go of her." The 2 words were quiet, almost calm, but they carried a weight that made the entire room go still in an instant. Priya's grip on Elena's wrist loosened immediately, as though her hand had acted on its own before her mind caught up. She turned, along with everyone else, toward the man walking through the parting crowd. Damian Cross moved like he owned the room, because in every way that mattered, he did. He was tall, dressed in a black suit tailored so precisely, it looked as though it had been sewn onto him, and his expression carried none of the polite, empty warmth that filled the rest of the ballroom. His dark eyes moved from Priya's face to Elena's wrist, still red from where fingers had pressed into her skin, and something in his jaw tightened. Elena had never seen him before, but she recognized the reaction of everyone around her. Men who moments ago had been laughing along with Priya now stood a little straighter, a little more careful. Women who had been whispering behind their glasses suddenly found their champagne very interesting. Whoever this man was, the room feared him, and it feared him completely. "Mr. Cross," Priya said, her earlier confidence draining from her voice. "I didn't realize you were—" "I asked you to let go of her," Damien said again, his tone never rising, never needing to. "You did, now step back." Priya stepped back. Elena watched, stunned, as one of the most self-assured women she had ever met retreated 3 full steps without argument, without even the pretense of an excuse. Whoever Damien Cross was, his word in this room was not a suggestion. Damien did not look at Priya again. He turned instead toward Elena, and for a moment something in his expression softened, in a way that seemed almost out of place on a man who carried himself like a blade. He extended his hand, palm up, waiting. Elena hesitated. She did not know this man. She did not understand why he was defending her, or why the room had gone so silent around them, or why her heart was suddenly pounding so hard she could hear it in her own ears. But something in his eyes told her it was safe to trust him, at least for this moment, in this room. She placed her hand in his. Damien did not shake it. He lifted it, slowly, deliberately, and pressed his lips against the back of her knuckles, in a gesture so old-fashioned and so genuine that a collective gasp rippled through the crowd around them. It was not the kind of gesture men like him performed for waitresses at charity galas. It was the kind of gesture reserved for someone important, someone who mattered. "Thank you for your patience tonight," Damien said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "This event would fall apart without people like you keeping it running. I am sorry it took me this long to notice what was happening." Elena could not speak. Her wrist still ached faintly where Priya had grabbed it. But the warmth of Damien's hand around hers, the gentle press of his lips against her skin, made the pain feel very far away. She searched his face for some clue, some explanation, but found only quiet certainty, as though he had done exactly what he meant to do and would not explain himself further. Priya's face had gone pale. "Damien, I had no idea she was someone you didn't need to know who she was to treat her with basic decency," Damien said, finally turning his eyes back toward her. His voice remained calm, but there was an edge beneath it now, sharp enough to cut. "That should not have required my presence in this room." The silence that followed stretched long enough to become its own kind of punishment. Priya opened her mouth twice and closed it both times, clearly searching for words that would not come. Her friends had already begun to drift away, distancing themselves from her the way people distance themselves from a fire before it spreads. Damien turned his attention fully back to Elena. "Are you hurt?" "No," Elena managed, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I'm fine, thank you." "You don't need to thank me." His eyes held hers a moment longer than was comfortable, though Elena found she did not want to look away. "What is your name?" "Elena Voss." Something flickered across his face when she said it, something like recognition, though Elena was certain they had never met. She would have remembered a man like this. His presence alone was enough to fill a room twice this size. "Elena," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "It's a pleasure to properly meet you." "Properly?" The word slipped out before she could stop it. "Have we met before?" For a moment, Damien looked as though he might answer. His lips parted, and something serious settled behind his eyes, the kind of seriousness that belonged to a much longer conversation than a crowded ballroom could hold. But then the moment passed, and he simply offered her a small, careful smile instead. "Finish your shift," he said gently. "You won't be treated like that again tonight. I'll make sure of it." Before Elena could ask what he meant, or press him further on the strange familiarity in his voice, Damien turned and walked back through the crowd, which parted for him just as readily as it had before. Whispers erupted the moment his back was turned, a wave of hushed voices trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Who was that waitress? Why did Damien Cross know her name? Why had he kissed her hand in front of 200 guests like she was someone worth protecting? Elena stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom floor, her wrist still warm from his touch, her mind spinning with questions she could not answer. She was, By every measure that mattered in a room like this, a stranger, a woman in a uniform that did not fit right, working a job most of these guests would never think twice about. And yet a man everyone feared had just knelt, in every way that counted, before her. One of the other waitstaff, a young man named Colin who had been assigned to the same section of the ballroom, appeared at her side and steered her gently toward the kitchen doors. Before anyone could ask her questions she had no answers for. "Do you know who that was?" Colin whispered once they were through the doors and out of sight of the guests. His eyes were wide with something between fear and awe. "No," Elena admitted. "Should I?" Colin let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Elena, that's Damien Cross. People don't say his name too loud in this city. He runs half of what happens after dark, and most of what happens before it too. I've heard stories. Nobody crosses him and walks away smiling." Elena's stomach turned. Then why would he defend me? "That," Colin said, glancing back through the small window in the kitchen door toward the ballroom, where Damien now stood near the far wall, his eyes still, unmistakably, tracking Elena's movements, "is exactly what everyone out there is asking themselves right now." Elena leaned against the steel counter, trying to steady her breathing. Her wrist still carried the faint ghost of Priya's grip, and her knuckles still carried the warmth of Damien's mouth. Two very different touches, two very different kinds of power, and somehow she had survived both in the same 5 minutes. She thought of her mother, resting in a hospital bed across town, unaware that her daughter had just become the center of attention in a room full of the city's most dangerous and powerful people. She thought of the rent due at the end of the month, the shifts she still needed to work tonight, the ordinary problems of an ordinary life that suddenly felt very far away. Through the small kitchen window, she caught Damien's eyes one more time. He did not look away when she noticed him watching. He simply held her gaze, steady and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it to understand her. Elena did not know what tonight meant. She did not know why a stranger had defended her, or why his voice had felt, somehow, less like a stranger's voice than it should have. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that whatever had just happened in that ballroom was only the beginning. Somewhere behind her, the kitchen door swung open again, and one of the event coordinators rushed in, breathless. "Elena," the coordinator said, eyes wide. "Mr. Cross wants to speak with you, privately. He's waiting." Elena's heart climbed into her throat. She smoothed down the front of her uniform with hands that would not quite stop shaking, and walked back toward the door, toward the ballroom, toward whatever was waiting for her on the other side. The coordinator led her not back into the main hall, but down a quiet side corridor lined with tall windows overlooking the garden below. The noise of the party faded behind them with each step, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier the closer they got to the small private lounge at the end of the hallway. The coordinator stopped outside a set of double doors, knocked twice, and left without another word, as though she did not want to know what happened inside. Elena pushed the door open slowly. Damien stood by the window, his back to her, a glass of water untouched on the small table beside him. He turned when he heard the door, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The room was quiet enough that Elena could hear her own pulse. "You didn't have to bring me here," she said finally, staying near the doorway. "I appreciate what you did out there, truly, but I don't understand why. Sit down, please." Damien gestured to the chair across from him, his voice gentler now than it had been in the ballroom. "You're not in trouble, Elena. I only wanted a moment away from all those eyes." She hesitated, then took the seat, perching on the edge of it, the way someone does when they are not sure they are allowed to stay. Damien remained standing a moment longer, before finally sitting across from her, close enough that she could see the faint tension still lingering in his shoulders, as if some part of him had not fully let go of the anger from the ballroom. "I don't make a habit of embarrassing guests at events I attend," he said, "but I won't apologize for what I did to Priya Whitlock. She has needed someone to challenge her for a long time. You didn't need to defend me the way you did." Elena studied his face, searching for something she could not quite name. A quiet word would have stopped her. "You didn't need to kiss my hand in front of 200 people." Something shifted behind his eyes, quick and unreadable. "No," he admitted. "I didn't need to. I wanted to." The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than any explanation could have. She looked down at her hands, still faintly marked where Priya's fingers had pressed too hard, and tried to steady her thoughts. "Do we know each other, Mr. Cross? You said something earlier about meeting me properly." For a long moment, Damien said nothing. He studied her, the way a man studies something he has thought about for a long time, but never expected to see in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower, quieter, almost careful. "It's a long story," he said. "One I don't think tonight is the right time to tell." "That's not much of an answer." A faint, almost reluctant smile touched the corner of his mouth. "No, it isn't. But it's the honest one I can give you right now." Elena felt frustration rising beneath her curiosity, but something about the sincerity in his voice kept her from pushing further. She had learned, over years of hard work and harder disappointments, when to trust her instincts about people. Every instinct she had told her this man, dangerous as he clearly was to everyone else in that ballroom, meant her no harm. "I should get back to work," she said eventually, rising from the chair. "I still have a shift to finish." "You don't," Damien said. "I've already spoken to the event coordinator. Your shift ends now. You'll still be paid in full." Elena blinked. "You didn't have to do that either." "I know." He stood as well, close enough now that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "There's a car waiting outside that will take you home safely. No one will bother you again tonight." She wanted to argue, to insist she did not need his help, that she was capable of finishing her shift and finding her own way home like she always had. But exhaustion, both from the long hours on her feet and from the strange, overwhelming events of the evening, settled heavily over her, and she found she did not have the strength to refuse. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for tonight, whatever your reasons were." Damien walked her to the door, and just before she stepped through it, he spoke once more, his voice low enough that it felt meant only for her. "You are not a stranger, Elena," he said. "Not to me. I know that doesn't make sense right now, but someday it will." Elena walked out into the corridor with those words echoing in her mind, more confused and more curious than she had been all night. Behind her, through the closing door, she caught one last glimpse of Damien standing alone by the window, his eyes fixed on nothing, lost in thoughts she could not begin to guess. The car waiting outside the grand hall was long, black, and far too expensive for a woman who took the bus to work every morning. The driver held the door open without a word, and Elena slid into the seat, her reflection ghostly in the tinted window, as the city lights blurred past. She did not know where tonight's strange encounter would lead her, but she understood, with a certainty that settled deep and quiet in her chest, that her life had shifted onto a different path the moment Damien Cross had knelt to kiss her hand in front of a room full of strangers who had called her one. 6 months earlier, Elena had pulled a stranger from a burning car on a rain-soaked highway, and she had never learned his name. The memory came rushing back to her the moment she sat in the dark car speeding away from the charity gala, and once it started, she could not make it stop. It had been a night much like this one, wet and cold, though far less glamorous. She had been driving home from a late shift at the diner where she worked before the agency job, her old car sputtering along the highway, when she saw the flames ahead. A sleek black car had spun off the road and slammed into the guardrail, its front end crushed, smoke curling up from beneath the hood. Elena had pulled over without thinking, the way people do when instinct moves faster than fear. She remembered running through the rain, remembered the heat from the growing fire, remembered pulling open a door that would barely budge and finding a man slumped against the steering wheel, blood running from a cut above his eyebrow. She had not known his name that night. She had not asked. She had simply hooked her arms beneath his shoulders and dragged him away from the wreck, seconds before the flames climbed higher, both of them collapsing onto the wet grass at the edge of the highway as the car behind them groaned and hissed. He had opened his eyes just long enough to look at her. "Stay with me," she had said, pressing her jacket against the cut on his head, her hands shaking from adrenaline more than cold. "Help is coming. Just stay awake." He had not spoken. He had only stared at her with an intensity that startled her, even in the chaos of the moment, as though he were trying to memorize her face before the darkness took him under. Then, from somewhere down the highway, headlights had appeared, and 2 black cars had pulled up fast, doors opening before they even fully stopped. Men in dark suits had rushed toward them, and one had gently but firmly pulled Elena back, while the others lifted the injured man and carried him toward the second car. "Wait," Elena had called out. "Is he going to be okay? Should I call an ambulance?" "He'll be taken care of," one of the men had said, his voice clipped and urgent. "You should go home. Forget you saw this." "Forget I saw this?" she had repeated, stunned. "I just pulled him out of a burning car." The man had studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then pressed a folded stack of bills into her hand before she could refuse it. "For your trouble, and for your silence." Elena had thrown the money onto the ground the moment the cars pulled away, insulted by the implication that her help had been for sale. She had stood alone on the dark highway for a long time afterward, soaked through and shivering, wondering who the man had been and why armed men had arrived to collect him instead of paramedics. She had told no one about that night, not even her mother. It had felt, somehow, like a secret that was not entirely hers to share. She had never expected to see his face again. Now, sitting in the back of Damien Cross's car 6 months later, the pieces began falling into place with a clarity that made her chest tighten. The scar. She had noticed it earlier that night in the ballroom without fully registering it, a thin, pale line above his left eyebrow, mostly hidden beneath his dark hair. She had seen it up close once before, freshly cut and bleeding, on a rain-soaked highway with fire reflected in his eyes. Damien Cross was the stranger she had pulled from the wreckage. Elena pressed her hand against her mouth, stunned by the realization. Everything from tonight suddenly made a terrible, beautiful kind of sense. The way he had looked at her when she said her name. The way he had called her not a stranger, despite everyone else in that ballroom believing exactly that. The strange, gentle certainty in his voice when he told her someday it would make sense. He had recognized her. He had known who she was the entire time. The car pulled up outside her small apartment building a few minutes later, and Elena stepped out onto the sidewalk in a daze, her mind still racing through the events of the past 6 months. She barely registered climbing the stairs to her apartment, barely registered locking the door behind her, and sinking onto the edge of her bed still in her uniform. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment on the highway over and over, trying to reconcile the wounded stranger she remembered with the powerful, feared man from the ballroom. The following morning, a knock on her door pulled her from a restless, shallow sleep. She opened it to find a woman standing in the hallway, elegant and composed, holding a small leather folder against her chest. "Miss Voss? My name is Naomi Delacroix. I work closely with Mr. Cross. May I come in?" Elena hesitated, still groggy, still unsettled by the events of the night before. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Naomi said gently. "But something has changed, and Mr. Cross felt you deserved an explanation before rumors reach you first." Elena stepped aside and let her in, offering the only chair in her small living room while she perched on the arm of the couch across from it. Naomi opened the leather folder, but did not immediately look down at it, choosing instead to study Elena's face with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. "6 months ago," Naomi began, "Mr. Cross's car was run off the road during what should have been a routine drive across the city. It was not an accident. A rival family had discovered the route his convoy typically used, and they attempted to eliminate him before his security detail could intervene." Elena's stomach turned cold. The men in the black cars, was that his security? Yes, they arrived 4 minutes after the crash, which in our world is an eternity. In those 4 minutes, a young woman none of us knew pulled him from a burning vehicle and kept him conscious until we arrived. Mr. Cross has spent 6 months trying to find her. Why didn't he just look for me sooner? He knew what I looked like. Naomi's expression grew more careful. It was not that simple, Miss Voss. In his world, showing interest in someone, especially someone with no connection to it, puts that person in danger. The men responsible for the attack were dealt with, but Mr. Cross could not be certain there weren't others watching, waiting to see if he had any weaknesses. Reaching out to you directly, at the wrong moment, could have put your life at risk. Elena sank slowly onto the couch, trying to absorb everything Naomi was telling her. So he just waited? He searched, quietly, through channels that would not draw attention. Hospitals, highway cameras, anything that might lead to the woman who saved his life, without asking for anything in return. It took longer than he wanted. Then last night, at an event he almost did not attend, he saw you across the ballroom, and 6 months of searching ended in a single moment. The pieces clicked together fully now, and Elena felt an overwhelming rush of emotions she did not know how to name. Relief that the mystery finally had an explanation. Disbelief that a man of his position had spent half a year searching for a stranger. And beneath both of those, something warmer and more frightening, a feeling she was not ready to examine too closely. "What does he want from me?" Elena asked quietly. "He asked me to make it clear that he wants nothing from you," Naomi said. "He only wants the chance to properly thank you, and to make sure that whatever attention last night's events bring, you remain safe." People noticed what happened at that gala, Miss Voss. Word travels quickly in circles like ours, and not everyone in those circles wishes Mr. Cross well. A chill settled over Elena at the warning buried in Naomi's careful words. "Are you saying I'm in danger because of what happened last night?" "I am saying it would be wise for you to have protection, at least until we understand how far the rumors have spread." Naomi closed the leather folder gently. "Mr. Cross has arranged for a security detail to remain near your building for the time being. You won't see them unless something requires it. He did not want to frighten you by explaining this himself, given everything you learned last night was already a great deal to process." Elena thought of her mother, resting in a hospital room across town, entirely unaware of the danger that might now surround her daughter because of a good deed performed 6 months ago on a rainy highway. Fear rose in her chest, sharp and immediate, replacing the warmth she had felt moments before. "My mother," she said suddenly. "Is she safe? She's in the hospital. She can't protect herself if—" "She is already being watched over," Naomi said quickly, clearly anticipating the question. "Mr. Cross arranged additional security at the hospital the moment he confirmed your identity last night, before you even left the gala. Your mother is safe, Miss Voss. You have my word." The knowledge that Damien had already thought to protect her mother, before Elena herself had even considered the danger, settled something anxious in her chest, even as it raised new questions about exactly how much influence and reach this man truly possessed. She studied Naomi's calm, professional expression, and found herself asking the question that had been building since the moment she woke. What kind of man is he? Really, not the version everyone whispers about at parties. Naomi considered the question for a long moment, as though genuinely weighing how much to share. "He is not a gentle man, Miss Voss. I won't pretend otherwise. The world he inherited demanded things of him that I don't think he would have chosen for himself, given another life. But in 6 months of searching for you, he turned down opportunities, canceled meetings, and spent resources most men in his position would have considered wasteful, all to find one woman who asked for nothing and expected nothing in return. That tells you something about him that the rumors never will." Elena did not know how to respond to that. She sat quietly, turning the words over in her mind, while Naomi rose and smoothed the front of her tailored jacket. "Mr. Cross would like to see you again, when you're ready," Naomi said. "There is no urgency. Take whatever time you need to process everything, but I suspect he won't stop thinking about you until he does." After Naomi left, Elena remained on the couch for a long time, staring at the closed door, her thoughts a tangled mixture of fear, curiosity, and something dangerously close to longing. 6 months ago, she had saved a stranger's life on a rainy highway and walked away expecting nothing. Now that stranger controlled more power and danger than she had ever imagined touching her own quiet life, and somehow, impossibly, he had spent half a year trying to find her. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, an unfamiliar number lighting up the screen. She answered cautiously. "Elena." Damien's voice was calm, steady, achingly familiar now that she understood where she had first heard it, rough and pained on a dark highway 6 months ago. "I wanted to give you space, but I find I can't quite manage it. Would you allow me to see you again? Somewhere quiet, away from crowds and cameras." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the pull of a decision that would change the direction of her life, no matter which way she chose. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I'd like that." "Tomorrow evening then," Damien said, and she could hear something like relief in his voice. "I'll send a car. And Elena, thank you. For the highway. And for last night. I don't think I've properly said that yet." "You kissed my hand in front of 200 people," Elena said, a small, unexpected smile tugging at her lips despite everything. "I think that counts as thank you." "That," Damien said, "was something else entirely." The line went quiet for a moment, comfortable rather than tense, before he said goodbye and ended the call. Elena sat alone in her small apartment, phone still warm in her hand, and understood, with a growing certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that whatever was beginning between them had already moved far beyond anything she could easily walk away from. The next evening arrived slower than Elena expected, each hour stretching thin with nerves she could not quite explain away. She changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a simple green dress, the nicest thing she owned, and told herself it did not matter what she wore, since this was not really a date, only 2 people who owed each other an honest conversation. She did not fully believe her own reasoning, but it helped steady her hands as she waited by her window for the car Damien had promised. It arrived exactly on time, the same long black vehicle from the night before, though this time the driver greeted her by name with a small, polite nod that suggested he had been told exactly who she was and exactly how carefully she should be treated. The drive took them away from the busy center of the city, past the tall buildings and crowded streets, out toward the quieter hills where the noise of traffic faded into the rustle of trees along a private road. The house that came into view took her breath away, in a way she had not expected. It was not what she imagined when she pictured a man like Damien Cross, no cold marble or imposing gates, but instead, a warm stone house, nestled among old trees, lit softly from within, more like a home than a fortress. Damien stood waiting at the top of the front steps as the car pulled to a stop, dressed simply in dark trousers and a gray sweater that made him look, for the first time since she had met him, like an ordinary man, rather than someone the entire city seemed to fear. "You came," he said, and there was something almost boyish in the relief that colored his voice. "I said I would." Elena climbed the steps toward him, suddenly conscious of every movement, every breath. "This isn't what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Something colder, bigger, less like an actual home." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I spend enough of my life in cold, big places. I didn't want this to be one of them." He led her inside, through a hallway lined with simple artwork rather than the ostentatious displays of wealth she had braced herself for, and into a small dining room where a table had been set for 2, near a wide window overlooking the dark garden outside. A modest meal waited for them, nothing elaborate, and Elena found herself grateful for the lack of spectacle after the overwhelming grandeur of the gala. They talked through dinner about small things at first, careful, testing things, the kind of conversation 2 strangers have when they are trying to decide how much of themselves to reveal. Elena told him about her mother, about the long hours at the diner before the agency job, about the ordinary dreams she had once carried, before life narrowed her focus down to survival. Damien listened more than he spoke, his attention so complete and unwavering that Elena found herself talking longer than she intended, comfortable in a way she had not expected to feel around a man capable of silencing an entire ballroom with 2 quiet words. "Tell me about the highway," she said eventually, setting down her fork. "I want to hear it from you. What really happened that night?" Damien's expression grew serious, the easy warmth from earlier settling into something heavier. "A rival organization wanted me removed from a position of influence I hold in this city. They arranged for my car to be forced off the road, expecting the crash itself to finish what they started, or for their own men to arrive before mine did. They did not expect a stranger to stop on a dark highway and pull me out before the fire reached the fuel line. I didn't think about any of that in the moment," Elena admitted. "I just saw a car on fire and a person inside it. There wasn't really a decision to make. That's exactly why it mattered so much." Damien's eyes held hers, steady and intent. "Most people in this city, if they knew who I was, would have kept driving. You didn't know, and you still stopped. You still stayed, even after my men arrived and everything about the situation must have looked wrong to you." "It did look wrong," Elena said honestly. "Men in suits pulling you away, instead of calling an ambulance. Someone offering me money to forget what I saw. I threw it on the ground, you know. I wasn't trying to be paid for helping someone. Something shifted in Damien's face, a flicker of quiet astonishment. I didn't know that detail. My men reported that you refused the payment, but not that you threw it back. It felt insulting, Elena said, like helping you was a transaction instead of just the right thing to do. Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You have no idea how rare that is, Elena. In my world, everything is a transaction. Every kindness has a price. Every favor a debt attached. You gave me something, with no strings attached, and I have spent 6 months trying to understand why that unsettled me as much as it did. And now that you understand? Elena asked softly. Now, Damien said, his voice dropping lower. I understand that I don't want to let you walk out of my life a second time. The words hung in the quiet room between them, heavier than anything spoken at the gala, more honest than anything whispered in the private lounge the night before. Elena felt her heart climbing into her throat, caught somewhere between fear and something far more dangerous, something that felt suspiciously like hope. Damien, she started, unsure of what she even meant to say next. You don't have to answer tonight, he said gently, seeming to sense her hesitation. I only wanted you to know where I stand. Whatever you decide, you and your mother will remain protected. That was never conditional on anything else. Elena studied his face in the soft light of the dining room, searching for the calculation she expected to find in a man of his reputation, and finding instead only quiet, patient sincerity. Whatever darkness lived in the rest of his world, in this room, with her, he seemed determined to offer nothing but honesty. I need time, she admitted. This is a lot, all at once. Take whatever time you need, Damien said. I've already waited 6 months. I can wait a little longer. As the car carried her home later that night, Elena pressed her forehead against the cool window and watched the lights of the city blur past, her mind full of a man who had built an empire out of fear and yet had shown her nothing but gentleness since the moment their paths crossed again. She did not know yet where this would lead, but she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and unsettled her, that there was no path forward that did not run directly through him. Glass exploded across Elena's kitchen floor as a brick crashed through her window, and a folded note tumbled out onto the tile, wrapped tight with a rubber band. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she stared at the shattered glass scattered across the counter, the cold night air pouring through the jagged hole where her window used to be. For a moment, she could not move, could not breathe, frozen by the sudden violence of the sound still ringing in her ears. Then instinct took over, and she grabbed her phone from the counter with shaking hands. She did not call the police, she called Damien. He answered on the first ring, and the moment she told him what happened, his voice turned sharp and urgent in a way she had not heard from him before. Stay away from the windows, lock your door, I'm sending someone right now, and I'm coming myself. Elena crouched low near the far wall of her kitchen, away from the broken window, the folded note still sitting untouched on the floor where it had landed. Part of her wanted to read it immediately, to understand what threat had just been thrown into her home. Another part of her, the part still trembling from the sound of shattering glass, wanted to leave it exactly where it lay, until someone else could tell her it was safe. The knock on her door came only minutes later, faster than she thought possible, and when she opened it, 2 of Damien's security men stepped inside, scanning the apartment with quick, practiced eyes, before one of them carefully lifted the note using a gloved hand. Mr. Cross wants you to leave with us, the taller of the 2 men said. Now, if possible. Leave? To where? His estate. He'll explain everything when he arrives. Elena barely had time to grab a bag of essential belongings before she was ushered down to a waiting car, her mind still reeling from the suddenness of everything. The drive to Damien's estate felt longer this time, tension replacing the nervous anticipation of her first visit, and by the time the car pulled up the long private road, Damien himself was already standing on the front steps, waiting. He crossed the distance between them the moment she stepped out of the car, his hands settling gently on her shoulders, as his eyes searched her face for any sign of injury. Are you hurt? Did the glass reach you? I'm fine, Elena said, though her voice still trembled slightly. Just scared. What was in the note? Damien's jaw tightened. A warning. Someone wants me to believe that caring about you was a mistake. They're wrong, but I won't pretend the threat isn't real. He led her inside, into the same warm dining room from their first dinner together. Though tonight, the atmosphere felt entirely different, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with nerves, between two people getting to know each other. Naomi appeared a few minutes later, her usual composed expression replaced by something more serious, a tablet in her hands displaying security footage from outside Elena's building. "We identified the person who threw the brick," Naomi said, turning the screen toward Damien. "Low level, likely paid to deliver the message rather than acting independently. But the note itself suggests knowledge of Elena's connection to you that shouldn't have spread this quickly." "Priya," Damien said quietly, his voice cold in a way Elena had not heard before. "She's been talking." "It's possible," Naomi agreed. "Word from that gala reached further than we anticipated. If the wrong people learn that a woman close to you exists, someone with no protection of her own, they may see an opportunity to reach you through her." Elena felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the night air still lingering on her skin from the broken window. "You're saying I'm a target now. Because of you." "You're a target because certain people are cowards who would rather threaten someone innocent than face me directly," Damien said, and though his voice remained controlled, Elena could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I should have insisted on stronger protection for you from the very beginning. This is my failure, not yours." "What happens now?" Elena asked. Damien was quiet for a long moment before answering, his eyes holding hers with a seriousness that made her stomach tighten with anticipation. "I want you to stay here, at the estate, until we understand exactly how far this threat extends, and who is truly behind it. Damien, I have a life, a job, my mother needs. Your mother remains protected wherever she is. I promise you that," Damien said gently, cutting off her protest before it could fully form. "And your job can wait, or I will personally ensure it does not suffer for your absence. Elena, please, I am asking you to let me keep you safe." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist on her independence, the way she always had, but the memory of shattering glass and the cold night air pouring through her broken window kept the words lodged in her throat. She thought of her small apartment, once her only sanctuary, now violated by a threat she barely understood. She thought of her mother, resting peacefully in a hospital bed, unaware of how close danger had come to the daughter who visited her every week. "All right," she said finally, quietly. "I'll stay." Relief flickered across Damien's face, quickly replaced by the controlled seriousness he seemed to wear like armor whenever business intruded on their time together. He turned to Naomi and issued a series of instructions Elena only partially understood. References to increased patrols, to men she had never met, to names spoken with the kind of weight that suggested old conflicts finally coming to a head. The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Elena moved through the wide, quiet rooms of Damien's estate with a strange mixture of gratitude and discomfort, aware that every kindness shown to her came wrapped in the shadow of danger she had not asked for and did not fully understand. She spent her mornings on the phone with the hospital, checking on her mother, relieved each time to hear that nothing had changed, that the added security remained unnoticed and unnecessary so far. She spent her afternoons, increasingly, with Damien himself. He worked long hours, disappearing for stretches into a private office at the back of the house where Elena was told, gently but firmly, not to follow. But in the evenings, he sought her out consistently, drawn to her company in a way that surprised them both. They walked the gardens together as the sun set, talked about nothing important and everything that mattered, and slowly, carefully, the careful distance between them began to narrow. "You don't have to entertain me every evening," Elena told him one night, as they sat together on the wide stone terrace, overlooking the darkened garden. "I know you're busy. I know this situation is serious." "I'm not entertaining you," Damien said. "I'm choosing to be here, with you, instead of anywhere else I could be. There's a difference." Elena studied his profile in the soft light spilling from the house behind them, the sharp lines of his face softened by shadow, the tension he carried through most of his day, noticeably absent in these quiet moments they shared. "Can I ask you something?" About your world? About all of this? Anything. Do you ever want out? All the power, the fear, the constant threats. Does it ever feel like too much? Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. I inherited this life. I didn't choose it, not at first. By the time I was old enough to consider walking away, too many people depended on the stability I provided. Too many enemies would have seen my absence as an opportunity to hurt the people I was responsible for protecting. That sounds lonely. It was, Damien admitted, turning to look at her fully. Until recently. Elena felt her cheeks warm despite the cool night air, and she looked away toward the garden, suddenly unable to hold his gaze. Damien, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know how someone like me fits into a life like yours. You saved my life on a highway without knowing my name, Damien said quietly. You threw money on the ground rather than accept payment for kindness. You stood in that ballroom and refused to let a room full of powerful people convince you that you didn't belong there, even when they tried their hardest to make you believe it. I think you fit into this life far better than you realize, Elena. I think you fit into mine. The words settled over her like warmth spreading through cold hands, and for a moment, the danger that had brought her to this estate, the broken window, and the folded threat still sitting in an evidence bag somewhere in Naomi's office, felt distant and unimportant compared to the quiet certainty in Damien's voice. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elena wandered down to the kitchen for water and found Damien still awake, standing at the window with a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, staring out at the dark garden with an expression she had not seen on him before, something haunted and distant. Couldn't sleep either? She asked softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and for a brief moment, before his expression composed itself, she caught a glimpse of something raw and unguarded, exhaustion layered over worry, layered over something that looked almost like fear. I keep thinking about how close that brick came to actually hurting you, if you'd been standing in the kitchen when it hit. But I wasn't, Elena said gently, crossing the room to stand beside him. I'm safe, because of you. For now. Damien set down his glass, his hands settling on the counter as though he needed something solid to hold on to. I've made enemies in this life, Elena, powerful ones, and now those enemies know exactly how to hurt me, through you. Then we face them, Elena said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. Together, whatever comes next. Damien turned to face her fully, something shifting in his expression, softening and hardening all at once. You say that so easily, as though you understand what you'd be walking into. I understand enough, Elena said. I understand that you've spent 6 months searching for a stranger who helped you without asking for anything, and that when you found her, you protected her instead of using her. I understand that whatever danger comes with your world, you've done everything in your power to shield me from it. That counts for something, Damien. It counts for a lot. He reached out slowly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with everything the rest of the world believed about him. I don't deserve the faith you keep putting in me. Maybe not, Elena said softly, but you have it anyway. The moment stretched between them, charged and fragile, neither of them quite willing to close the remaining distance, both of them acutely aware of how much had changed since a broken window had brought her to this house. 3 days later, Naomi arrived at breakfast with news that pulled the fragile piece of the estate apart. She set her tablet down on the table between Damien and Elena, her expression grim, in a way that made Elena's stomach tighten before a single word was spoken. We traced the money, Naomi said. The man who threw the brick was paid through account linked, indirectly, to the Ashford family. They've been circling your territory for over a year, Damien. This looks like their first real move. Damien's expression darkened, all traces of the softness from the night before disappearing behind a mask of controlled fury. The Ashfords wouldn't act without a reason to believe they could win. Someone gave them confidence they didn't have before. There's more, Naomi continued, glancing briefly at Elena before returning her attention to Damien. Priya Whitlock has been seen at 2 events in the past week, with members of the Ashford family. It's possible she said more than she should have, out of spite over what happened at the gala. Elena felt a cold weight settle in her chest. This is my fault. If I hadn't caused a scene, if she hadn't been embarrassed in front of everyone. "This is not your fault," Damien said firmly, his hand finding hers under the table, grounding her before the guilt could spiral further. Priya made a choice to speak recklessly out of wounded pride. The Ashfords made a choice to act on information they should have ignored. None of that responsibility belongs to you. "I want to talk to her," Elena said suddenly, surprising even herself with the decision. "Priya, I want to understand what she said, and to whom." "Absolutely not," Damien said immediately. "It's too dangerous. If the Ashfords are watching her, they may be watching anyone who approaches her as well." "Then arrange it somewhere safe," Elena pressed, "with your people nearby." "Damien, I spent years being talked over by people who assumed I couldn't handle difficult conversations. I can handle this one." Damien studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant respect flickering behind the worry in his eyes. He turned to Naomi. "Can it be done safely?" "With enough precautions, yes," Naomi said carefully. "A private location, our people stationed outside, minimal exposure time. I don't love the idea, but I understand why Elena wants this." The meeting was arranged for 2 days later, in a quiet tea house on the edge of the city that Damien's people had used before for delicate conversations. Elena arrived first, her nerves carefully hidden beneath a composed expression she had practiced in the mirror that morning. Priya arrived several minutes later, looking noticeably less confident than she had at the gala, her usual polish dimmed by something that looked, unexpectedly, like fear. "I didn't think you'd actually want to see me," Priya said, sliding into the seat across from Elena, her hands wrapping tightly around the teacup in front of her, as though she needed something to hold on to. "I want to understand what happened," Elena said, keeping her voice steady. "You've been seen with the Ashford family. After everything that happened at the gala, after Damien made his position clear, why would you associate with people trying to hurt him?" Priya's composure cracked slightly, her eyes dropping to the table. "Humiliated. You have to understand what that moment did to my reputation, being put in my place in front of everyone I know. When the Ashfords approached me, asking questions about who you were, about your connection to Damien, I told myself I was just making conversation. I didn't think it would lead to this." "A brick through my window could have killed someone," Elena said, her voice sharper now than she intended. "Do you understand that? This isn't about reputations anymore, Priya. This is about people's lives." Tears welled in Priya's eyes, and for the first time since Elena had met her, the cruel confidence that defined her seemed to crumble entirely. "I know. I've thought about nothing else since I heard what happened. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I was just so angry, and they were so easy to talk to, and I didn't think about the consequences until it was too late." Elena studied the woman across from her, searching for the calculated cruelty she had witnessed at the gala, and finding, instead, only genuine regret layered over fear. "What exactly did you tell them?" "Your name, that you worked events through an agency, that Damien seemed to know you from somewhere before that night." Priya's voice shook. "I didn't know where you lived, I swear. I don't know how they found your apartment." "They likely followed you, or someone else who knew," Elena said quietly, the pieces settling into place with grim clarity. "Every conversation you had with them was being watched, whether you realized it or not." Priya's hands trembled around her teacup. "What happens now? Are they going to hurt me too?" "I don't know," Elena admitted honestly, "but I think you need to tell Damien everything you just told me, all of it. If you cooperate, if you help him understand exactly what the Ashfords know, and how they're operating, it might be the only thing that keeps both of us safe." Priya nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes with a shaking hand, and for the first time, Elena saw not a cruel socialite delighting in someone else's humiliation, but a frightened young woman who had let jealousy and wounded pride lead her somewhere she never intended to go. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding, and Elena found that counted for something as they rose together to leave the tea house and face whatever came next. Outside, Damien's car waited at the curb, and as Elena climbed inside, she felt the weight of the conversation settle over her, heavier now that she understood the full shape of the danger closing in around them. Priya's information would help, she knew, but it would also confirm what Damien had feared from the beginning. The Ashford family was not testing the waters anymore. They were preparing for something far more serious, and Elena, whether she had asked for it or not, stood directly in their path. A gloved hand clamped over Elena's mouth the moment she stepped out of the pharmacy, and before she could scream, she was being dragged backward toward a waiting van. Her heart exploded into panic as her feet scrambled against the pavement, her fingers clawing uselessly at the arm locked around her waist. She had only left the estate for 20 minutes, insisting she needed to pick up a prescription for her mother herself, rather than sending someone else, certain that a quick errand in broad daylight would carry no risk. She had been wrong. The van door slid open, and Elena managed to twist her head just enough to bite down hard on the gloved hand covering her mouth. Her attacker cursed and loosened his grip for half a second, just long enough for her to scream, the sound cutting through the quiet street and drawing attention from a nearby shopkeeper who immediately reached for his phone. That half-second was all Damien's security team needed. 2 black cars screeched around the corner, and before the van could fully close its doors, armed men poured out, moving with the kind of speed and precision that only came from constant training. Elena was pulled free from her attacker's grip and shoved behind one of the security agents, her whole body shaking as the confrontation unfolded in front of her, quick and controlled, and utterly terrifying. Within moments, the men who had tried to take her were subdued, and Elena found herself pulled into the back of one of Damien's cars, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline of the past minute finally caught up with her. "You're safe," the agent beside her said firmly, his eyes scanning the street even as he spoke. "You're safe, Miss Voss. We've got you." Elena could not speak. Her hands would not stop shaking, and the phantom pressure of the glove against her mouth still lingered, making it hard to draw a full breath. The car sped through the streets back toward the estate, and by the time it arrived, Damien was already waiting on the front steps, his expression a mixture of barely controlled rage and raw fear that Elena had never seen on him before. He pulled her from the car and into his arms before she had even fully stepped out, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her cheek. "I told you not to leave the estate alone. I told you." "I know," Elena managed, her voice muffled against his chest. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to do something normal. Something for my mother, and I thought 20 minutes would be—" "They were watching," Damien said, pulling back just enough to look at her face, his hands framing her cheeks with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the fury still burning in his eyes. "They were watching this entire time, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. This is exactly what I was afraid of." Naomi appeared at the top of the steps, her usual composure replaced by a grim urgency. "The men have been taken for questioning. We'll know more within the hour, but the method, the timing, all of it points directly to the Ashfords. This wasn't a warning anymore, Damien. This was an attempt to actually take her." Something shifted in Damien's expression, the fear giving way to something colder and far more dangerous. Elena had seen glimpses of his power before, in the way rooms went silent around him, in the way even Priya's confidence crumbled under his gaze. But the look on his face now was different, deeper, the look of a man who had just watched something precious, nearly torn away from him, and had decided, in that moment, that restraint was no longer an option. "Gather the others," Damien said quietly to Naomi, his voice low and controlled, in a way that somehow felt more frightening than shouting would have. "It's time the Ashfords understood exactly what they've started." "Damien." Elena caught his arm before he could turn away, her fear for herself giving way to a different kind of fear. Fear for what he might do, what it might cost him. "Don't do anything that puts you in more danger, please." His expression softened, just slightly, as he looked down at her. "Elena, they just tried to take you off a public street in broad daylight. This isn't about danger to me anymore. This is about making certain they never believe they can try something like this again." He kissed her forehead, gentle, despite the storm clearly building behind his eyes, and then he was gone, moving through the house with Naomi at his side, already issuing instructions to men who materialized from every corner of the estate. Elena stood alone in the entryway, her hands finally steadying, trying to process the fact that she had come within seconds of being taken from everything and everyone she knew. The following hours passed in a tense blur. Elena remained in the estate's living room, unable to focus on anything, Unable to eat the meal one of the household staff gently placed in front of her, she thought of her mother, still recovering in the hospital, and called the number Naomi had given her days earlier, needing confirmation that the added security around her mother remained solid despite the chaos unfolding elsewhere. "She's safe," the voice on the other end assured her. "Nothing has changed here. You have my word." It was not much comfort, not with the memory of gloved hands and a waiting van still so fresh in her mind, but it was something to hold on to while she waited for news of Damien. He returned just after midnight, his shirt collar loosened, exhaustion etched into every line of his face, though something in his posture suggested the matter, whatever it had involved, was resolved. Elena rose from the couch the moment he walked in, searching his face for injuries, relief flooding through her when she found none. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Damien sank onto the couch beside her, running a hand over his face before answering. "The Ashfords will not be attempting anything else. Their leadership understands, very clearly now, the cost of what they tried to do today." Did anyone get hurt? "Only the people who deserved consequences for their choices," Damien said carefully, and Elena understood, from the deliberate vagueness of his answer, that this was as much detail as he intended to share. She did not push further. Some things, she suspected, were better left unknown, at least for now. "I was so scared," Elena admitted, her voice small in the quiet room. "Not just for myself, for you. When you left tonight, I didn't know if you'd come back the same." Damien reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, with a tenderness that felt entirely at odds with whatever had transpired over the past several hours. "I will always come back to you, Elena. That's not something you need to worry about." "You can't promise that," she said softly. "Not in your world." "No," he agreed. "But I can promise you that I will fight harder to make it true than anything else in my life. You are not a possession to be threatened or a bargaining piece to be taken. You are the first genuinely good thing that has happened to me in longer than I can remember, and I will not lose you to men who think fear is the only language worth speaking." Elena leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, the events of the day finally settling into something she could begin to process rather than simply survive. "What happens now? With the Ashfords, with all of this?" "Now it ends," Damien said quietly, "publicly and completely. There's one more thing that needs to happen before this thread is fully closed, and I'd like your help with it, if you're willing." "What is it?" "Priya has agreed to speak publicly about what she witnessed, about her own involvement, and about the Ashfords' role in everything that's happened. It will cost her socially, perhaps significantly, but it will also make clear to everyone watching that spreading information about you carries real consequences, and that protecting you is not a temporary arrangement on my part." Elena considered this for a long moment. "She's scared enough already. Are you sure this won't put her in more danger?" "The Ashfords' influence has been significantly weakened tonight," Damien said. "By the time Priya speaks, there will be very little left of their organization capable of retaliating against anyone. I wouldn't ask this of her, or involve you in it, if I thought it carried real risk." Elena nodded slowly, trusting his judgment even as the events of the day left her nerves still raw and unsettled. "Then I'll help, whatever you need." Damien pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and for a long while, neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in the quiet room, absorbing the fact that they had both survived something that could have ended so much worse. Outside, the estate's grounds remained dark and still, guarded now by a visibly heightened security presence that would remain in place for the foreseeable future. But inside, in this one small room, Elena finally allowed herself to feel something like safety. "Damien," she said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. "Earlier, when you said I was the first genuinely good thing that's happened to you in longer than you can remember, did you mean that?" "Every word," he said, turning to look at her fully, his eyes soft in a way that had nothing to do with the danger and violence that had defined the rest of his day. "Elena, I know this isn't the life you imagined for yourself. I know loving someone like me comes with risks most people never have to consider, but I have never wanted anything the way I want a future with you in it." The word love, spoken so plainly, so directly, settled over Elena with a weight that stole the breath from her lungs. She had felt the pull toward him growing steadily since that first night in the ballroom, had recognized it more clearly with every quiet dinner and every gentle conversation in the estate's garden, but hearing him name it so openly made the feeling impossible to deny any longer. "I love you too," she said softly, the words feeling both terrifying and entirely right as she spoke them. "Even knowing everything I know now, even after today." Damien's expression broke open with something raw and relieved, and he pulled her close, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that carried the weight of everything unsaid between them since the moment she had pulled him from a burning car on a rain-soaked highway. When they finally parted, foreheads resting together, Elena felt, for the first time since the brick had shattered her kitchen window, that the danger surrounding them had finally begun to loosen its grip. "There's still Priya's statement to get through," she said quietly, a small smile touching her lips despite everything. "And whatever comes after that." "There is," Damien agreed, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "But we'll face it together. Whatever comes next, you won't face it alone again." 3 days later, the same charity foundation that had hosted the gala organized a smaller gathering, this one intended to close out their annual fundraising season. Elena had not expected to attend, given everything that happened since the last event she worked in this very ballroom, but Damien had asked her to be present, quietly, near the back of the room, while Priya delivered a statement to a select group of the city's most influential residents. Elena watched from a distance as Priya took her place near the small podium set up for the evening's closing remarks. She looked different than she had at the tea house, still nervous, but steadier now, as though she had spent the past several days rehearsing not just her words but her courage. "Many of you know me," Priya began, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet ballroom. "You know my family, my position in this community. What you may not know is that several weeks ago, out of anger and wounded pride, I made choices that put an innocent woman's life in danger." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Elena felt her own pulse quicken, watching from the shadows near the kitchen doors, the same spot where Colin had once steered her away from questions she could not answer. "I spoke carelessly to people I should not have trusted, and that carelessness was used to justify violence against someone who had done nothing except show more grace and courage than I did that night," Priya continued, her voice wavering only slightly. "I take full responsibility for my part in what followed. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am telling you this because silence has already caused enough harm, and I refuse to let my pride cause any more." The room remained silent as Priya stepped back from the podium, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, but her chin held high in a way that reminded Elena, unexpectedly, of her own effort to maintain dignity in this same room weeks earlier. Whatever judgment the crowd carried, Priya had chosen honesty over further hiding, and Elena felt a flicker of genuine respect for the woman who had once humiliated her so thoroughly. Damien appeared at Elena's side moments later, having watched the statement from across the room. "How do you feel?" "Strange," Elena admitted. "Part of me still remembers exactly how it felt when she mocked me in this same room. But watching her stand up there just now, admitting everything in front of people whose opinions clearly matter enormously to her, that took real courage." "It did," Damien agreed. "Whatever comes of it, whatever consequences she faces socially, she chose to face them honestly rather than let the lie continue. That matters." Across the ballroom, several of Priya's former friends had already begun to distance themselves, their expressions cool and calculating, in a way that suggested her standing among them would never fully recover. But a few others approached her instead, quiet words exchanged that Elena could not hear from this distance, and Priya's shoulders seemed to ease slightly, as though she had braced herself for total isolation, and found, instead, that some relationships could survive honesty. "The Ashford name won't carry the same weight after tonight," Damien said quietly, watching as the story of Priya's statement clearly began spreading through whispered conversations across the room. "Word travels fast in circles like these. By morning, everyone who matters will understand exactly what happened and exactly why associating with what remains of that family carries real risk now." "Is it really over?" Elena asked. "The danger, I mean." "The immediate threat, yes," Damien said. "There will always be people in my world looking for weakness to exploit. That reality doesn't disappear because one family has been dealt with. But you, specifically, are no longer an unprotected target for anyone hoping to reach me through you. Everyone here tonight understands, very clearly, what it costs to threaten someone I love. The word love, spoken so casually now compared to the raw vulnerability of 3 nights earlier, still sent warmth spreading through Elena's chest every time she heard it. She slipped her hand into his, no longer caring who in the ballroom noticed the gesture, no longer feeling like a stranger dressed up to look like she belonged. "Dance with me," Damien said suddenly, nodding toward the small cluster of couples who had begun moving to the quiet music drifting from the string quartet in the corner. Properly this time, not in front of a crowd meant to humiliate you, but in front of one that's finally starting to understand who you really are. Elena laughed softly, the sound surprising her with how light it felt after weeks of fear and tension. "I'm not exactly trained for ballroom dancing, Damien." "Neither am I," he admitted, pulling her gently toward the dance floor anyway. "We'll figure it out together." They moved slowly among the other couples, imperfect and unhurried, and for the first time since the night a champagne glass had shattered against marble floor and changed the course of her life, Elena felt no eyes on her carrying judgment or cruelty, only the quiet, steady presence of a man who had chosen her, publicly and completely, over everything his world had once demanded of him. Near the edge of the dance floor, she caught sight of Priya once more, standing alone now that the small crowd around her had dispersed, watching Elena and Damien with an expression that held no trace of the old cruelty, only quiet, thoughtful resignation. Elena offered her a small, genuine nod, and after a moment of hesitation, Priya returned it, something like understanding passing silently between two women who had started this story on opposite sides of a very different kind of line. Elena turned her attention back to Damien, letting the music and the warmth of his hand at her waist carry away the last remnants of fear that had followed her through the past several weeks. Whatever waited beyond tonight, whatever new challenges his world might still bring to her door, she no longer faced them as a stranger, standing alone, in a room full of people who doubted she belonged. She faced them as exactly what she had become, the woman standing beside Damien Cross, chosen and protected, and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely unafraid. A single white envelope arrived at the estate, addressed only to Elena, and the moment she opened it, her hands went cold. Inside was an invitation, thick, cream paper embossed with gold lettering, to the very same charity foundation's spring gala, the flagship event of the entire social calendar, larger and more extravagant than anything Elena had attended since the night everything began. What made her hands tremble was not the invitation itself, but the name printed beneath the elegant script requesting the pleasure of her company. Miss Elena Voss, guest of honor. She carried it into the kitchen, where Damien sat reviewing papers over his morning coffee, setting it down in front of him without a word. He read it once, then looked up at her with a small, knowing smile that told her immediately this had not been a surprise to him at all. "You did this," she said, half accusation, half disbelief. "I made a request," Damien corrected gently. "The foundation was more than willing to grant it, given everything that happened at their last event under their roof. They'd like to formally recognize you this year, rather than simply employ you to serve drinks to the people who will be recognizing you." Elena sank into the chair across from him, staring down at the invitation, as though it might dissolve if she looked at it too long. "Damien, guest of honor means giving a speech. It means standing in front of everyone who was there that night, everyone who watched what Priya did to me, everyone who spent the past 2 months whispering about who I am and how I fit into your life." "Yes," Damien agreed simply. "It means exactly that. I don't know if I can do that." Damien reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "You stood in that ballroom once already, and refused to let a room full of powerful people convince you that you didn't belong there. You've since faced threats against your life, helped negotiate a fragile peace with a woman who once tried to humiliate you, and stood beside me through consequences most people in your position would have run from. I think you are more than capable of giving a speech, Elena. The only question is whether you want to." Elena studied the invitation for a long moment, weighing the fear still curled tight in her chest against something else. something that had been growing steadily since the night Damien first kissed her hand in front of 200 strangers. Pride, perhaps, or something closer to defiance, a refusal to let the version of that night defined by cruelty and humiliation remain the only version anyone remembered. "I want to," she said finally, surprising herself with how certain the words felt once spoken aloud. "I want to stand in that room again, not as someone's guest, and not as someone hiding from what happened, but as myself." Something warm and proud flickered across Damien's face. "Then we'll make sure you have exactly that chance." Before the preparations could fully begin, one final piece of unfinished business demanded attention. Naomi arrived at the estate 3 days after the invitation had appeared, her expression carrying the same grim seriousness Elena had come to recognize as a warning of trouble. "We found the last of the Ashford network," Naomi said, setting a folder on the table in front of Damien. "A cousin, previously unknown to us, who has been quietly trying to rebuild what remains of the family's influence. He's been asking questions about Elena's schedule, about the gala." Elena felt the familiar cold weight of fear settle over her, the sense of safety she had begun to trust, suddenly fragile again. "Is he planning something?" "We believe so," Naomi said carefully. "Nothing confirmed yet, but the pattern is familiar. He may see the gala as an opportunity, given how public the event will be, and how personally invested you are in attending." Damien's jaw tightened, the same controlled fury Elena had witnessed the night of her near abduction flickering behind his eyes. "Then we make sure he understands, clearly and immediately, that continuing down this path will cost him everything the rest of his family already lost." "How?" Elena asked. "A private conversation," Damien said, "one that leaves no room for misunderstanding." The conversation happened 2 days later, in a location Elena was not told the details of, and though she spent the hours it took anxious and unable to focus on anything else, Damien returned that evening, looking tired but calm, the tension that had gripped his shoulders since Naomi's warning finally easing. "It's finished," he told her simply, settling beside her on the couch in the estate's quiet living room. He understands now, in terms that leave no ambiguity, that the Ashford name carries no more leverage in this city, and that any further attempt to use you against me will end considerably worse for him than it did for his relatives. "You didn't hurt him," Elena said, though it came out more as a hopeful statement than a genuine question. "No," Damien confirmed, watching her carefully. He walked away with a very clear understanding of his limits, and nothing more. "I know how important it is to you that I choose restraint where I can." "I'm trying, Elena, for you." Something in her chest loosened at his words, gratitude and relief tangled together with the deeper understanding that the man she loved was actively working to soften the edges of a world that had once seemed entirely unyielding. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trying. It means more than you know." "Nothing else stands between us in that ballroom now," Damien said, pulling her gently against his side. "Whatever fear kept you awake these past few nights, you can let it go. This is truly, finally, over." Elena allowed herself to believe him, the tension of the past 2 months slowly draining from her shoulders as she rested against him in the quiet room, the distant sound of the estate settling into evening around them. For the first time since a brick had shattered her kitchen window, she felt the future stretching ahead of her, not as a series of threats to survive, but as something worth genuinely looking forward to. The weeks leading up to the gala passed in a blur of preparation unlike anything Elena had experienced before. Naomi helped her choose a gown, deep emerald green, rather than the borrowed black uniform that had marked her as invisible the first time she stood in that ballroom. Elena practiced her speech late into several nights, revising the words again and again, until they finally felt honest rather than rehearsed, until they said exactly what she wanted the room to understand. Her mother, recovering steadily and finally strong enough to leave the hospital for short outings, insisted on being there the night of the gala, seated in a place of honor near the front, where Elena could see her throughout the evening. The sight of her mother, healthy and smiling, and finally free from the fear that had defined so much of the past several months, gave Elena a strength that settled deep and steady beneath her nerves. The night of the gala arrived faster than Elena expected, and as the car carried her toward the same grand building where everything had begun, She found herself remembering, with startling clarity, the exact feeling of dropping that champagne glass, of Priya's cruel words echoing across the marble floor, of the humiliation that had once made her want to disappear entirely. This time, when she stepped out of the car, she walked toward the entrance with her chin lifted, her hand steady in Damien's, as photographers along the entrance called out for their attention, no longer strangers to the city's curiosity, but a couple whose story had, in the months since that first gala, become something the entire social circle whispered about with fascination, rather than scorn. Inside, the ballroom looked much as it had before, chandeliers blazing overhead, the same string quartet playing near the far wall, the same crowd of wealthy guests circulating through clusters of quiet conversation. But everything felt different this time. Heads turned as Elena entered, not with the cold curiosity of strangers judging an outsider, but with genuine interest, even respect, for a woman whose courage had, in its own quiet way, become something of a local legend. Priya found her near the edge of the room before the evening's formal proceedings began, dressed simply compared to her usual extravagance, her expression carrying none of the old arrogance. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me the chance to make things right, instead of simply letting the consequences fall on me alone." "You made the choice to be honest," Elena said. "That was yours to make, not mine to give." Priya offered a small, genuine smile, the first Elena had ever seen from her that held no cruelty behind it. "For what it's worth, I hope tonight goes exactly as you deserve." When the moment finally arrived for Elena to step up to the small podium at the front of the ballroom, her heart pounded so loudly she was certain the entire room could hear it. She found Damien's eyes across the crowd, steady and encouraging, and her mother's proud smile near the front, and slowly, the fear that had gripped her all evening began to ease into something steadier. "2 months ago," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "I stood in this exact spot, wearing a uniform instead of a gown, working an event most of you barely noticed I was part of. Someone told me that night that I was just a stranger, that I didn't belong in a room like this, and for a moment, standing here, I believed it." A hush fell over the crowd, and Elena continued, her voice growing steadier with every word. "I've learned since then that belonging isn't something other people get to decide for you. It's something you claim for yourself, through the choices you make, and the courage you find when everything feels impossibly hard. I didn't become someone who belongs in this room because a powerful man chose to defend me that night, though I will always be grateful that he did. I became someone who belongs here because I refused to let one moment of cruelty define the rest of my story." Her eyes found Damien's again, and something in his expression, open and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen him allow in public, gave her the courage to continue. "I've faced things this year I never expected to face, danger I never imagined would touch my life. But I've also found something I never expected to find, a love built not on status or convenience, but on the simple truth that kindness, freely given, matters more than any of us realize in the moment we offer it." The room remained utterly silent, hanging on her words in a way that felt nothing like the mockery of 2 months earlier. Elena took a steadying breath and finished the thought that had kept her awake through countless nights of practice. "So to anyone in this room who has ever been made to feel like a stranger somewhere they belonged, I hope tonight reminds you that the opinions of people determined to make you feel small carry far less weight than your own refusal to disappear." The applause that followed was immediate and genuine, rippling across the ballroom in a wave that brought unexpected tears to Elena's eyes. She stepped down from the podium on unsteady legs, overwhelmed by the response, and found Damien waiting for her at the base of the small stage, his expression full of a pride so open it stole the breath from her lungs. "That," he said quietly, pulling her close, "was exactly the woman I fell in love with." Before Elena could respond, Damien reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, and the room around them seemed to hold its breath collectively as he lowered himself to one knee in front of everyone who had once watched her humiliation unfold in this very space. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely now as she looked down at him, the entire ballroom fading into a soft blur around the two of them. "Elena Voss," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly, despite the emotion thick beneath it. You pulled me from a burning car without knowing my name, and you have been saving me in quieter ways ever since. I am not a simple man, and I cannot promise you a simple life, but I can promise you that every day for the rest of it, I will choose you, publicly and completely, exactly as I am choosing you right now. Will you marry me? The ballroom that had once watched her called a stranger now watched her, breathless, waiting for her answer, and Elena found she did not need even a moment to consider it. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with joy, as Damien rose to slide the ring onto her trembling hand. Yes, absolutely yes. The applause that erupted this time was louder than before, filling the grand ballroom with a warmth that reached every corner of the room, and as Damien pulled her into his arms, kissing her fully, and unhurried in front of everyone who had once doubted she belonged in a room like this, Elena felt the last shadow of that old humiliation finally, completely dissolve. Later that night, as the celebration continued around them, Elena found a quiet moment near the same tall windows where Damien had first led her away from the crowd 2 months earlier. She looked out over the dark garden below, the ring catching the light on her hand, and felt Damien's arms wrap gently around her from behind. "Any regrets?" he murmured against her hair. "None," Elena said, leaning back into him, watching their reflection in the glass, two people who had found each other twice, once on a rain-soaked highway, and once in a ballroom full of strangers who had underestimated them both. "I used to think being called a stranger in a room like this was the worst thing that could happen to me. Now I understand, it was just the beginning of becoming exactly who I was always meant to be." Behind them, the string quartet began a new song, and Damien turned her gently to face him, drawing her back toward the dance floor where their story had truly begun. "Come on," he said, a smile finally free of all the weight and worry of the past 2 months. "Let's give them something else to talk about." And as they moved together across the ballroom floor, surrounded by a crowd that now watched with admiration instead of judgment, Elena understood, with a certainty that settled warm and permanent in her chest, that she had never truly been a stranger at all. She had simply been waiting for the right person to see her clearly, and in doing so, to help her finally see herself. Near the edge of the dance floor, her mother watched with tears of joy still glistening in her eyes, her hand pressed to her chest as though she could hardly believe the woman spinning gracefully beneath the chandeliers was the same daughter who had once worked double shifts just to keep the lights on in their small apartment. Elena caught her mother's gaze over Damien's shoulder and smiled, grateful beyond words that she had lived to see this moment, healthy and present, and finally free from worry. Colin, the young waiter who had once steered Elena away from the crowd's curious stares, stood near the kitchen doors in a borrowed suit, having been invited personally by Damien, as a small thank you for his kindness that first night. He raised his glass toward her from across the room, a wide, delighted grin on his face, and Elena laughed, lifting her own glass in return, before Damien spun her gently into another turn. As the night wore on, the music softened, and the crowd began to thin, leaving only the closest guests, still lingering beneath the chandeliers. Damien guided Elena toward the same tall windows where their private conversation had first begun, and together, they watched the last of the garden lights flicker against the darkness outside. "Do you remember what you told me, that first night in the private lounge?" Elena asked, resting her head against his shoulder. "I told you a great many things that night," Damien said, a faint smile touching his voice. "Which part do you mean?" "You said I wasn't a stranger to you, that someday it would make sense." She turned to look up at him, her eyes soft with everything the past 2 months had taught her. "It makes sense now, all of it." Damien pressed a slow, gentle kiss to her forehead, then to the ring now settled permanently on her hand. "I meant every word that night, even before I understood how deeply true it would become. You were never a stranger, Elena. Not on that highway, not in this ballroom, not anywhere you've stood since. You were always exactly where you belonged." Outside, the first hints of dawn had not yet touched the sky, but inside the quiet ballroom, surrounded by the last remnants of a celebration that had rewritten the worst night of her life into the best one, Elena felt nothing but certainty about the future stretching out ahead of her, bright and unafraid, held steady by a love that had proven, again and again, exactly how far it was willing to go.